welcome back to the channel. My name is Muriel, and in this video I will be doing my reading wrap-up for the month of November and the first half of the month of December, because I will be abroad the last week of this month, and given I have two end of the reading year videos, if you will, to do when I come back, I figured I might as well lessen my cognitive load, so to speak, and divide what would otherwise have been my December reading wrap-up between this video and next year's January reading wrap-up. So there you go, with a little explanation. In this video, I will be mentioning a total of 9 books. 2 books that were non-fiction, a trilogy of novels, and 3 standalone novels. Starting with the non-fiction, I read Ursula K. LeGuin's poetry collection, Late in the Day, Poems 2010 to 2014. It's no secret, Ursula K. LeGuin is one of my favourite authors of all time, but until this collection, I'd never actually read any of her poetry, or broader non-fiction writing for that matter. So I will remedy that soon enough. And, well, I really enjoyed this collection overall. In Late in the Day, LeGuin mixes free verse with more traditional or traditionally structured forms of poetry, and whilst I didn't love every single one of the collection's poems, enough of them touched my sense of aesthetics and or heart, quite simply. Something about LeGuin's writing just feels soothing to my soul, regardless of its form, apparently. This collection also features a foreword that goes into the overarching thematic through line of its poems, which, broadly speaking, centers on presence, our relationship to the world or nature, one another, etc. And then it also features an afterword in which LeGuin shares her understanding of and preferences with regards to poetry that I found really interesting. And then an incredibly based speech she gave in 2014 when she was awarded the Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters. And you can check this speech out on the internet if you're interested. You can find it on YouTube very easily. So I gave Late in the Day an 8.5 out of 10 rating because it was just lovely. And also quite special given that this was a gift from my boyfriend. So thank you to him for giving me this lovely collection. After that, I read late feminist thinker Bell Hooks's The Will to Change, a book discussing men, masculinity, and love I was really looking forward to, and which I ultimately found disappointing. This was in large part due to the fact I clearly misunderstood what kind of book it was going to be when I picked it up. The Will to Change is not really a work of feminist theory or feminist social science stricto sensu. Rather, it is an essay aimed primarily, clearly, towards men and opening men's minds to the benefits rejecting patriarchy and what Hooks terms in the text patriarchal masculinity would hold for them in terms of improved loving relationships and more generally quality of life. On those merits alone, I think this is a decent book and probably deserving of a 7 out of 10, but I expected something more, or at the very least something different. I found genuinely good to very good kernels of insight in this essay, yes, most of which I was already familiar with, but I appreciated here the way Hooks skillfully and succinctly expressed them. On the whole, her analysis of masculinity, disconnection, and how these things impact relationships and love between men and women, or fathers and their sons, etc., was good and well articulated. But this really is a pure essay. There are absolutely no references, footnotes, reference bibliography, what have you, in Hooks's book. Yet, she made a lot of sweeping generalizations and grand claims that triggered my itch to cry, citation needed. Some of her arguments were also a little strange, off-key, or simply lacked too much nuance. I mean, she argued, for instance, that Harry Potter, of all things, was the prime example of a patriarchal, male, genius protagonist, and I was like, excuse me, what? Have we read the same books? I mean, did she read the Harry Potter books? I don't know. The will to change as a whole just felt a bit all over the place at times, and incredibly repetitive as well. It really, in my subjective opinion of course, shouldn't have been as long as it was, especially given the lack of nuanced development too many of Hooks's arguments suffered from. Her essay also felt a bit too self-helpy in places, for my taste at any rate. Several pop psychology writers were cited in text, or at least that's what I think they were. For one thing. For another, Hooks used a fair amount of spirituality or religion-laden language. She talked about church, the souls of men, divine masculinity, etc. And it's not like I necessarily object to this on a purely personal level as a non-atheist person, but what has this got to do with challenging patriarchy intrinsically? A lot of feminist women, a lot of women period, and a lot of men, of course, are atheist or just agnostic, and this kind of language seemed potentially off-putting to me and thus largely counterproductive. I was, additionally, thoroughly confused by the fact Hooks seemed to conflate maleness with masculinity. She talked a lot about patriarchal masculinity, then feminist masculinity, but I am more of a gender-critical feminist, if not anti-gender feminist. Masculinity and femininity are both inherently problematic to me because, according to my understanding of things, both inherently derive from what we call patriarchy, or what I like to call androcracy. There is no redeeming of gender really in my book, to put it simply. So it was just really weird that Hooks both seemed to understand this and agree with it, kind of, the inherent issues with gender, and embrace gender, or parts of it, as an inherent natural part of human nature. Maybe I misunderstood, I'm not sure. And I suppose I kind of get it from an appeal to male readers' perspective, as realistically, a lot of men won't want to reject masculinity wholesale, and the same can be said of women with femininity, and fair enough, we don't all have to agree with this kind of stuff, but still, I didn't really like it, so Finally, there was a smidge of fellow feminists bashing, and of minimizing the harms of gendered socialization for girls. That left, yes, a really bad taste in my mouth. Worse than that, however, Hooks's analysis completely ignored, as far as I could tell, the costs of emotional labor for women. And she kind of gave the impression she believed women are never collectively open to the idea of helping men connect with their inner emotional selves, or to the idea of helping them resist the male-specific injunctions of patriarchy. And I was like, are you shitting me here? Of course, we need to work with men to reform society because we all live together in it, right? But I think a lot of feminist women are, in fact, open to sharing the load, as it were, and have been for however many decades now. The problem is that way too often, they find themselves having to shoulder the load all by themselves, and having to do the work of change, as it were, for men, not with them. Whether on a collective or interpersonal level, the crucial concept of gendered entitlement and lack of emotional reciprocity weren't discussed nearly enough in Will to Change. And that felt especially frustrating to me as a woman who has suffered, to the point of abuse at times, from a severe lack of emotional and caring reciprocity in some of her heterosexual relationships. I understand, I think that this book was primarily written for male readers, but still, I'm sorry, compassion has to go both ways, and I think you should be able to say that in a book aimed at men primarily as well. So yeah, Hooks's essay was a massively mixed bag. I gave it a 6.5 out of 10, so it's not garbage either, but I wouldn't particularly recommend it to fellow feminists looking for theoretical analysis grounded in actual data, though I guess I would not recommend it to feminist and feminist ally beginners, if you will, interested in the topic of, sure, toxic, if you must use that qualifier, masculinity. Onto the fiction now. I dedicated most of the month of November to reading Hilary Mantel's acclaimed Cromwell trilogy. Oof, this is heavy. The first book of which, Wolf Hall, has a BBC adaptation I actually watched a few years ago. I think I remember enjoying it well enough. And then Bring Up the Bodies and The Mirror and the Light are books 2 and 3 of the trilogy. I believe, well, The Mirror and the Light, I think, won the Man Booker Prize. Did Wolf Hall? It might have, but don't quote me on that, so you can go check that out if you're interested. Now, this isn't something I would have necessarily picked up on my own, but I was gifted these physical copies of the trilogy by my ex David for Christmas back in 2021, and to his credit, these are very nice hardback editions. Though I just wasn't able to make time for them until this past November. This is a classic or standard, or what I'd call tight trilogy. Book 2 directly follows on from Book 1, Book 3 directly follows on from Book 2. And as its title suggests, the Cromwell trilogy essentially gives an account of Thomas Cromwell's life and rise to power in the Tudor court of King Henry VIII of England, told from his exclusive point of view, and an inextricably linked account of the political and religious turmoil that took place in 16th century Europe, chiefly with, yes, the Protestant Reformation, and with the focus being here on England, obviously. I really enjoyed it. Its first selling point for me was its character work. Okay, I'm not a character-driven reader when it comes to SFF. It's a bit different with other genres anyway. So the character work, which I found, quite frankly, superb. And it's actually on this principal merit that David sold Hilary Mantel's work to me. Now, it obviously shines most through Thomas Cromwell himself, whom I found to be a fascinating shades of grey character. At times he kind of reminded me of Tyrion Lannister a smidge, but there are also differences. That being said, the depth and nuance of Mantel's character work almost equally applied to a fair few of her story's secondary characters as well. Its second selling point was its quality as a very informative and meticulous work of historical fiction. Whilst Mantel's story very much remains a story fiction, you can tell a lot of research and care went into the creation of her trilogy. And I really appreciated the fact she laid out the specific liberties she took with historical fact in her books afterwards, and they were also themselves very informative. So yes, the documentary aspect of the Cromwell trilogy was certainly very engaging for me. I particularly enjoyed the discussions these books featured about, in this case, Christian religion. Though I guess it was about religion in general, but also, yes, focused on Christianity via the historical upheaval of the Protestant Reformation, and the theming this tied into on the purposeful enacting of large-scale societal change and the morally complex and fraught relationship between, perceived at least, idealist ends and the practical means employed to reach them. On a stylistic level, I enjoyed Mantel's, to me, skillful and evocative prose overall, but I wasn't a big fan of her decision to utilize the third person as a kind of replacement for first-person narration. By this, I mean that Thomas Cromwell was almost always referred to as he in the text, in a way that was unnecessarily confusing. It was certainly highly confusing at first, but I think it remained confusing in places later on in the story, especially on audiobook. Because yes, I mix-read these books. This is also most definitely a slower story and an expansive story. I mean, it covers all of Thomas Cromwell's life. This was mostly fine, though past a certain point it did start to feel a little too slow. What bothered me more, however, was that it also then felt a smidge too long past a certain point, given the sheer amount of descriptive detail, which I felt was at times unnecessary, Mantel went into in these chunky boys. And I would have quite honestly struggled to finish the Cromwell trilogy had I not combined reading my physical copies with listening to their audiobook versions. And pairing of that with another activity as well. And yes, I managed to do that. It was a good solution for me. Finally, I can't pretend that as a whole, Mantel's trilogy really featured what I love most in terms of world building, theming, or even, I suppose, character types. Though once again, the character work was excellent. Alternatively, and to oversimplify, let's just say I'd rather have my political machinations in chonky fantasy a la Song of Ice and Fire, rather than chonky historical fiction set in the 16th century. Still, the quality of these books is, in my opinion, of course, undeniable. I also felt surprisingly, genuinely moved to some tears by the trilogy's conclusion, and this is something that more or less always gets a bonus point out of me. So yeah, rating the series was a little more difficult than usual for me. If I were more of a non-speculative historical fiction buff and or nerdier about Tudor England and Reformation Europe, I would have happily given this trilogy a very strong 8 out of 10, but I'm not rating non-fiction here, after all, and art is also about raw personal enjoyment. The simple fact is I would probably not reread these books, but they were certainly absolutely worth reading all the way through once. So yes, I would definitely recommend this trilogy if you enjoy historical fiction, and perhaps more specifically than that, historical fiction that, in my opinion, was very well written and that features really just excellent character work. And as a quick little addendum, I don't think you need to be overly familiar with real-world history to enjoy these books. Though I conversely won't argue against the fact having a basic understanding of this period probably added something to my reading experience. Moving into December now, I first read Seanan McGuire's Middlegame, a book I primarily decided to read because my ex David recommended it to me. I still have a few of these to go through because it's a weird closure thing for me. And yes, I must admit my appreciation of it is not insignificantly tied into the relationship I had with him. Middlegame primarily centers on a pair of artificially, alchemically created twins named Dodger and Roger, who keep finding and losing one another in various ways as they grow up, and who are ultimately meant to incarnate fundamental principles of creation, here symbolized by pure mathematics and language, and following law taken from the Western alchemical/esoteric tradition, all in service to a heretical sect, or rather duo, of American alchemists with questionable motives, shall we say. This makes Middlegame what I'm going to call esoteric fantasy, but whilst it is certainly strongly pulled forward by its alchemical motif, I'd argue it also qualifies as a platonic love story, and it is this latter aspect I enjoyed the most. Indeed, I was really moved by Dodger and Roger's developing relationship, one full of friendship and love, but not of the non-platonic or romantic kind. All the more so, given Dodger and Roger also read as neurodivergent coded to me. Dodger, the female of the pair, especially. Both are written as intellectually gifted, and yes, there is a world-building and narrative reason for this that ties back to the book's central alchemical motif, but Dodger specifically clearly read, once again, to me, as autistic coded, and I strongly related to her struggles with people, alienation, loneliness, etc. The author's skillful prose certainly helped to convey the delicate beauty of her characters' feelings for one another and the pain they experienced because of their isolating differences. Though once again, this especially applied to Dodger, the female MC. I also generally enjoyed the quotes she chose as epigraphs for the different parts of her novel. Outside of the twins' love story, if you will, I can't say I got too much in terms of deeper theming, though what there was centered on the consequences of playing God, the value of connection, the value of difference, despite the pain, and the necessary balance between complementary principles wasn't bad by any means. Finally, with regards to plot and world building, both were intrinsically tied to Western alchemical lore and concepts in a way that felt satisfying to this esotericism nerd. I don't think I'd ever really come across a novel dedicated to this specific branch of the Western esoteric tradition before, and it was pleasantly refreshing. Could more have been done with this? Yes, though I understand this is the first book in a trilogy, and perhaps this motif is developed more fully in books 2 and 3, but I can't say I'll get to them anytime soon, if ever. Additionally, the story does play around with time resets, but whilst I am generally very wary of time travel at this point as a narrative device, I'm happy to say and relieved to say it was here utilized skillfully enough. I don't know that I will ever reread this one, but it's not entirely off the table either, which is why I've rated Middlegame with a strong 7 out of 10, and why I would confidently recommend it to readers interested in esoteric fantasy or just real-world set fantasy that feels a bit different, and or readers looking for neurodivergent characters, or, neurodivergent coded characters and character relationships of any kind in their fantasy. After that, I read Sayaka Murata's Earthlings, a short novel translated from the Japanese by, I can't remember the name of the translator, apologies for that. I picked this up because I thought its story would center on a neurodivergent MC and feature fantastical elements of some sort. I was vaguely aware it would also feature traumatic experiences, and indeed, it does. Be warned, there is a graphic depiction of child rape in this novel, and other disturbing things. And yeah, this wasn't at all what I expected. Earthlings essentially reads as general fiction, with caveats I'll get to shortly, about a girl named Natsuki who feels different and alienated from her family, her cousin Yu accepted, and broader society as she grows up. So much so, in fact, she believes herself to be a magician and her hedgehog plushie to be an envoy from the planet Popinpobopia. Try saying that 3 times fast, I dare you. Natsuki, you quickly learn, suffers, sadly, from verbal and physical abuse at the hands of her mother and sister, and eventually falls prey to other forms of abuse as well. Like I said, there is a graphic depiction of child rape in this book. Only to wind up, as an adult, in an asexual marriage of convenience, if you will, with an equally alienated feeling man. I believe Earthlings' theming was largely meant to center on the negative or damaging experience of difference, alienation, etc., especially in the face of a very constraining and normative society. The latter is in fact referred to as the factory in the novel, which, let me tell you, is incredibly subtle. Not. Given the book's disturbing content, I've also seen some people argue this book features commentary about the pros and cons of violating social taboos as well, in relation to the previous theme. My response to all of the above is, sure, I guess, but I for one didn't find any of it effective in the slightest. For starters, there was next to no meaningful character work done in Earthlings. Natsuki, her cousin Yu, and her husband, what's his face? I've forgotten his name because of course, didn't feel like actual people to me, neurodivergent or otherwise. And no, as an FYI, I didn't read Natsuki as autistic coded at all, though yes, I am aware the author herself, I think, is in fact autistic, but as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter. I'll agree there was CPTSD at play in Natsuki's case, sure. Beyond that, I don't know. If I had to slap a diagnostic label onto Earthlings' characters, I guess I'd go with something like schizotypy, maybe, but A, I'm not qualified to do so, and B, it doesn't really matter, since, like I said, the novel's characters barely qualified as such to me. The prose, for its part, felt very dry, purely utilitarian, which, fair enough, there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself. Still, I often wondered, do people actually talk like this? This didn't exactly alleviate the feeling of unreality, for lack of a better term, I got from the book's characters and their interactions with one another. This was perhaps a function of the book's translation into English, though I don't want to throw shade to the translator either, or perhaps this was entirely by design, but either way, it made matters worse for me. Because ultimately, Earthlings felt like a true tragedy vignette someone lifted out of a magazine and decided to pad out into a novel with a decidedly undetermined feeling genre. It's as if the book didn't entirely know what it wanted to be. General fiction? Horror fiction? Magical realism, but also not really? The shift in gears with regards to the story's more disturbing material, and without spoiling too much of anything, descent into violent psychosis, shall we say, also contributed to a disagreeable feeling of tonal dissonance. I just always hate it when I'm left wondering, what did I just read? What, pray tell, was the point here? And to reiterate the theming I personally read into Earthlings on alienation and societal oppression was just laid on way too thick and thus poorly executed. Additionally, given the book's, a bit out there ending, I retroactively felt like it mishandled the usage of child sexual abuse and trauma, which is a bit blech, shall we say. It's not like Earthlings was garbage either, but since I didn't get anything out of it, I couldn't, in good conscience, rate it with anything above a mediocre 5.5 out of 10. And wouldn't particularly recommend this one, unless you just really enjoy stories that, well, indulge in shocking content for its own sake. Because yeah, sorry not sorry, that's what the disturbing stuff ultimately felt like to me. Then I read The Library at Mount Char, a novel written by Scott Hawkins that was a bit bizarre. Was it bizarre I enjoyed? Well, I mean, kind of? There was a plot, yes, involving a library run by a mysterious figure called Father, who goes missing, librarians who used to be Americans, and weird events centered on all of that. I won't say much more because I really think it's best to go into this one as blindly as possible. But also, fair warning, don't expect any hand-holding here whatsoever. There are also characters, yes, and strange bits of world-building. Our MC is a female librarian named Carolyn. She has adopted siblings. They all live, or rather lived, with the aforementioned father, who may or may not be fully human, and some wild animals, and reanimated dead folks. This father has allies and enemies, such as a forest god and Barry O'Shea, some sort of deep-sea monster. But don't expect much here in the way of deeper character work or deeper world-building. Did it all amount to much in terms of theming or impactful storytelling? No, not really. The world-building, for its part, was just too patchy in places for my taste. I guess this is fine if the point here was vibes more than anything else. But otherwise, yeah, no, I didn't get much out of The Library at Mount Char beyond its weird aesthetics, which, don't get me wrong, were really well done. I was, in fact, vaguely reminded of Miavillian fiction at times, in terms of said aesthetics though, not theming, to be very clear. The story stakes turned out to be quite literally cosmic, but I won't say more than that, but they never actually felt cosmic, if that makes sense. The story also featured a couple of intense action sequences, yes. A pretty endearing human-lion relationship, that gets an automatic point. Bits of character development tied to traumatic experiences. Yes, very traumatic experiences, but none of those things ever really came together for me in a more meaningful or emotionally significant way. It all remained rather disjointed, which is a little disappointing given the otherwise neat bits of world-building this novel unashamedly featured. Finally, I was also thrown off somewhat by the book's humorous notes, which only worsened the feeling of disjointedness I got from it, though I didn't necessarily flat out dislike all of said humorous notes. But yeah, was I supposed to read the library at Mount Char as some giant, weird, absurdist joke, given the father and micro spoiler, I guess, library of godlike knowledge motif of it all? I'm not sure. But again, this may have been part of the point for all I know. Still, this was an interesting novel, without a doubt. It was certainly, yes, worth reading once. And as such, I gave it a 6.5 out of 10 rating. I'd tentatively recommend this one to, well, fellow weird fiction enthusiasts, with the caveat that you shouldn't expect too much out of it in terms of deeper world building, theming, or even emotional impact. Think of it as entertainment-driven rather than ideas-driven weird fiction, if you will. Finally, and before I leave off, I have to mention the fact I finished watching the anime Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood in the lovely company of my boyfriend during the first week of December. And around the same time I finished Middlegame too, so alchemy for the win, I guess, because I'm happy to say I really enjoyed Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. I finally found an anime that worked for me. Huzzah! So Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood centers on two teenage brothers, Edward and Alphonse Elric, who are alchemists and who lost parts, or the entirety for Alphonse, of their physical bodies after an alchemical ritual they performed as children to resurrect their just deceased mother went terribly wrong. They work for the militaristic government of their country and become embroiled with nefarious political and, yes, alchemical machinations that could have potentially cataclysmic consequences for their country and the world at large. I think this anime's greatest strength is that it not only felt very satisfying, it felt very satisfying in a very balanced way. All of its elements felt well to very well realized. It worked as one unified, evenly structured, and paced story with strong but organic emotional and storytelling beats. Yes. Additionally, almost none of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood's narrative, world-building, or thematic threads were left hanging loose by the conclusion of its story. Besides Edward and Alphonse, the anime featured a wide and varied cast of characters, most of whom had satisfying arcs. There was, yes, a tiny bit of anime goof, but because it was used sparingly and in a manner that didn't detract from the story's more serious or poignant thematic and emotional beats, it didn't bother me at all. In fact, and to my surprise, I kind of thought some of it had a certain charm in places. Also, there wasn't any real fan service that I noticed, so hallelujah, praise the Lord. On the world building and theming fronts, well, unlike Neon Genesis Evangelion, Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood actually meaningfully committed to its esoteric motif to a commendable extent. It was part and parcel of the anime's world-building, magic system, narrative drive, and was used to develop theming on human hubris and its consequences and humankind's place in the universe in a way that, moreover, had pantheistic flavoring, shall we say. And well, I certainly love to see it. Beyond that, there was also theming on familial love, brotherhood, and, well, you know, friendship, perseverance in the face of adversity, and all of that, taken with the character work, undoubtedly helped to make Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood an emotionally impactful and genuinely moving story for me. Now, I don't think it was perfect either, as I had a couple of nitpicks with the finer print, as it were, of the world building and theming, but overall, I had a really good time watching this anime, and sure, yes, it helped that I watched it and shed the feels with my boyfriend, who recommended we watch it together in the first place because he'd already seen it 2 or 3 times, I can't remember exactly, and loved it. But outside of that, I did genuinely enjoy it on its own merits, so if I had to give it a rating, I would go with an 8 to 8.5 out of 10. that will be all for my November and decent chunk of December reading and viewing wrap up. Like I said in my introduction, I will be going abroad the last week of December, so this will be my last video for the year 2023. So not only do I hope you had a good reading and everything else month of November and first part of the month of December, I genuinely hope that this past year was decently kind to you. And if it wasn't, well, I hope that 2024 will be better. So I wish everyone the best possible end of year celebration, whether they're spiritual, religious, or secular. And as usual, I hope you'll have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves, be kind to yourselves during this period as well. Thank you for the continued support, and I shall see you all, well, next year in 2024. But until then, bye-bye.